Yeah, so thank you all for coming. So to our inaugural Blackwell seminar. So as for those of you who were in our department last spring, you saw we announced the Blackwell seminar last spring and established it to honor the contributions of David Blackwell to mathematical statistics, game theory, probability theory, and information theory. And I can say that probably like many others in the audience here, that I regularly make use of David Blackwell's results in my own work. So maybe before I introduce Elena, I just want to give a little background on Blackwell's career for those who haven't heard it before. It's really quite remarkable, both in terms of the depth and breadth of his accomplishments, and also in terms of the numerous obstacles that he overcame in the process of doing this. So Blackwell received his PhD in 1941 at the age of just 22. And then he immediately went and spent a year at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. While Blackwell was there, Jerzy Neyman tried to recruit him to UC Berkeley, at that time to the Department of Math. There wasn't a Department of Statistics at Berkeley at the time. And Neyman and in fact, the rest of the faculty were in favor of offering Blackwell a position. However, in the end, the department head's spouse objected to this. Because it was regular for the department to have departmental dinners over at people's houses, and she objected on inviting Blackwell to her house because he was Black. So Berkeley at that time did not extend Blackwell an offer. Following his time instead at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, Blackwell then went on to work at 3 historically Black colleges and universities, in particular Southern University, Clark-Atlanta University, and Howard University. And he remained at Howard for 10 years, quickly advancing to the role of full professor, and then serving as the chair of their math department for a number of years as well. In 1954, Blackwell was again recruited at Berkeley, again by Neyman, but this time to the Department of Statistics, the newly established Department of Statistics. Blackwell was in fact the first external recruit to that department. So you can see how highly Neyman thought of him and his work. And while at Berkeley, Blackwell had a number of accomplishments, including serving as department chair, associate dean, and supervising over 50 doctoral students, including June, who I think is here today. And just one more comment on his career. So another remarkable comment, sort of beyond just being a great statistician, he was also a great scientist. And this was recognized by the National Academy of Sciences, which in 1965 appointed him, and he was in fact the first Black American to be appointed to the National Academy of Sciences. So truly a remarkable career. So it's a great honor to establish this seminar to honor his career. And so this seminar will focus, so we'll give it each fall. We'll invite speakers. We're very lucky to have Elena as our inaugural speaker. Other years we'll likely invite external speakers as well. And this seminar will focus on topics at the interface between statistics and equity issues, such as racial disparities, social justice, and ethics. And speakers will be invited based on their contributions to these areas. Yes. Okay, and so, yeah, so we've been very lucky, as I said. So Elena agreed in the late spring to be our inaugural speaker. So Elena, for those who don't know her sort of impressive background, she graduated with a PhD in statistics from Carnegie Mellon in 2002 and has been a faculty member at UW ever since. She's done editorial work at a number of impressive journals, including JASA Theory and Methods, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and the Annals of Applied Statistics, among others. And in 2013, she won the Mitchell Prize for an outstanding paper that describes how a Bayesian analysis has solved an important applied problem. And her paper was titled Modeling Criminal Careers as Departures from a Unimodal Age Crime Curve, the Case of Marijuana Use. Elena also has a long interest in studying racial disparities in the peer review process. Maybe some highlights. So in 2014, along with her colleague Carol Lee here at the UW Department of Philosophy, she won an award from the NIH in a contest seeking to detect bias and boost fairness in how it reviews grant applications. And in this contest, their proposal was awarded the prize for the most creative idea for detection of bias in peer review. In 2018, Elena was awarded as PI a grant from the NSF to study their proposal further. So we're very lucky to have Elena. I think she's the perfect inaugural speaker. I don't think we could ask for anyone better. Maybe just before I get started and pass this off to Elena, just a reminder that if you have any questions during the talk, you can feel free to write them in the chat window. Or alternatively, and I think Elena said this was her preference, you can also raise your hand and unmute yourself, and Elena will clarify this when she starts talking. So Elena, thank you so much for agreeing to speak today, and you can take it from here.
Thank you, Alex, for the introduction and for establishing this seminar series. I think this is much needed, and I'm extremely honored to be the first speaker in this series. So I will start by sharing my screen with the slides. And to begin with, I will say that this talk, I decided to make it as much about the big topic, what do we know about racial disparities in NIH peer review, as about our own work. And my work here would not be possible without a number of collaborators. So first and foremost, Carol Lee, who is just an amazing collaborator. Sheridan did all of the groundwork that I will be presenting today. Richard Nakamura is the former director of the Center for Scientific Reviews at NIH. He made this work possible by working with the NIH to give us access to the data and working with us to actually make this work possible to be published and share the data to some extent. Mark Lindner, who oversaw the project from the CSR, and Chen, who did a lot of number crunching with the database that we as UW faculty could not access directly, but Chen was responsible for getting us the data that we needed. All right, so first I will talk about NIH grant review, assuming that you maybe know a little bit, but don't know much. So what is NIH? NIH stands for National Institutes of Health, and it's the primary agency of US government that is responsible for biomedical and public health research. And within NIH, the Center for Scientific Review is the center that is responsible for conducting this review. CSR works to see that NIH grant applications receive fair, independent, expert, and timely reviews that are also free from inappropriate influences. So NIH can fund the most promising research. A lot of the work about NIH Research Awards is done focusing on R01. R01 is a grant mechanism. These mechanisms constitute a major research funding route at NIH. It is often considered a milestone for junior faculty, as much as in some departments you cannot get tenure unless you get an NIH R01. These grants, as all other grants actually, most of the other grants at the NIH are reviewed in a multi-step process. First, there is a peer review, which evaluates scientific aspects of the research. And this peer review results in a summary of that evaluation that is also known as the impact score. Or you may have heard about the percentile scores. So these are directly related. Impacts get then transformed into percentiles. And then there is administrative review, which takes into account needs and priorities of the NIH. This review is done by NIH administering institutes or centers. And they also take into account things like public health burden and opportunities for scientific progress. NIH review process is inherently multi-level. As applications are submitted, R01 applications, they are assigned to a studies section. Then they are assigned usually 3 reviewers who provide preliminary scores for the application. Then about 55% of those that scored relatively well go on to be discussed by a study section. And among those, like applications, and it's less than 20%, and in some institutes and in some years, it can even be less than 10%, get funded by an NIH administering institute or center. So on this diagram, what is shown is how this process flows. So for example, in red, there is one PI who's submitting 2 applications. Each application is assigned a set of 3 reviewers. And then each application gets discussed into, if it goes on to discussion, it gets discussed into a scientific review group, and it can be in different places, right? Not necessarily all of the applications from one PI discussed in one review group. And here, for example, another PI is also submitting an application, which is, again, assigned to some reviewers. There are maybe overlapping reviewers. And then this application flows to a different scientific review group. And then scientific review groups are organized within integrated review groups. And at the very highest level, administrative review is happening here by NIH administrative institutes and centers. So this process is inherently multi-level. So what does prior research tell us about Black researchers being at disadvantage for NIH funding? Seminal papers by Donna Ginter, there are 3 of those published in 2011, 12, and 16. These papers pointed out that there are racial disparities in NIH R01 award rates. Donna Ginter analyzed applications reviewed during 2000 up to 2006 fiscal years. So she found that the award rate for applications from Black PIs during those years was roughly 55% of the award rate that was found for white PIs. So this is a huge gap. She also found in her papers that a substantial proportion of this funding gap can be explained by bibliometric measures, which is publications, citations, and journal impact factors of the PI. So a lot of this funding gap, but not all, can be explained by bibliometric measures. Then looking at which grants are awarded, she also found that the administrative review seems to function as needed. So grants are awarded on the basis of peer review, as summarized in impact score, and there's no difference by race or ethnicity. A follow-up paper, which was just last year, analyzed NIH R01 review data during a later period from 2011 to 2015. So this group by Hoppe et al. From the NIH, they checked for racial disparities, and they considered 6 different stages of the review process. And at each stage, they sought to see if there is a disparity by race. So first, they considered topic choice. And they found that Black investigators tend to propose research on topics with lower award rates. Second, they considered number of submissions, which investigators submit grants and how many grants they submit. So here they found that the number of submissions did not vary after controlling for some key covariates, but that is conditional on people actually submitting grants. Now the third stage, they looked into the process of selection into panel discussion. So remember we said that about 55% of all of the submitted R01 applications actually go on to be discussed by scientific review groups. And here they found that applications from Black investigators are only 76% as likely to be discussed compared to applications from white investigators. And they named this particular step as the largest gap that contributes to disparities in funding. They also found that there are disparities as impact score assignment during discussion stage. And for the other two stages that they considered, they looked at the funding decisions by institute and centers. And they found that controlling for these impact scores, basically for the peer review information, the funding decisions did not contribute to funding gap. So there was no difference by race at that point. And looking at resubmission rates, they found that Black PIs were not less likely to resubmit unfunded application once you control for the impact score of that application. Okay. So this paper was titled "Topic Choice Contributes to the Lower Rate of NIH Awards to African-American Black Scientists." And they actually did the quite complicated analysis to get at the identification of topics. So they analyzed text from the applications, and they relied on natural language processing and spectral clustering approaches that allow them to identify about 150 topic clusters among the applications. Then using these clusters, they found that these topics accounted for about 21% of the racial gap in finding success for the applications that were discussed. So what's interesting, that they do not appear to control for the multi-level structure in this research. And in fact, follow-up analysis done by another researchers at the NIH demonstrated that controlling for topic choice was in fact very similar as controlling for NIH administering institute or center. So a model from a different analysis that controlled for NIH administering institute or center accounted for 23% of the racial gap in funding. So this was quite surprising. And this latest finding, I quote from Mike Lauer's Open Mic, and the post is still available online. It's called Institute and Center Award Rates for Funding Disparities. And this is one of the figures from that post that showed award rates between 2011 and 2015 by NIH administering institute or center. So if you are one of those who is applying to NIH, you're probably interested where you fall. I didn't have space here to list all of these institutes and centers, but you can look it up on the online. So what is really obvious here, that there is a large difference in award rates by NIH administering institute or center, with the lowest rate right here being nothing else but minority health and health disparities, right? And the highest rate here being the I Institute. So what happened is that, in fact, Black researchers are disproportionately submitting their applications to the NIH institutes and centers with the lowest award rates, including 16% of all applications from Black researchers is being submitted to the Minority Health and Health Disparities Institute, which is very highly disproportional. So topic choice aside, the paper by Hoppe analyzed applications from 2011 to 2015, and those applications, unlike the applications that were analyzed by Donna Ginter earlier, they were scored under NIH enhanced peer review process that was adopted in 2009. So I will talk a little bit more about this review process, but you need to know that these two sets of grants are basically different. And the other key message from the paper by Hoppe et al. Is that the selection of applications for discussion was the largest single contribution to the funding gap. Now, if we add here that it is known that the average of the preliminary impact scores, that is before discussion, determines which applications enter the discussion stage, And if we add that the assigned reviewers' impact scores are closely related to the final post-discussion scores, it's obvious that somebody needs to look at the preliminary scores to understand more what is going on with the racial disparities in peer review. So between Donna Ginter's and the Hoppe et al. Papers, racial disparities in preliminary scores remained unexamined, and they seem to be a key in the NIH peer review process. So with this enhanced peer review process in 2009, the NIH decided to improve information and transparency for applicants and to increase attention to factors related to merit. They introduced a set of pre-specified criteria. So these are 5, and they're called significance, investigators, innovation, approach, and environment. And if you check NIH websites, or if you are a reviewer, you will get a table which summarizes this criteria precisely, states precisely what reviewers should be looking for as they are thinking about this criteria. NIH instructs reviewers to provide scores on these 5 criteria, to weigh the different criteria as they see fit in deriving their overall impact score. And they also say that the application does not need to be strong in all categories in order to be judged to have major scientific impact. This practice of scoring criteria and having clear criteria to score before deriving an overall impression about a candidate or an application, this practice is consistent with recommendations from psychological research. And it is a way to focus attention on factors related to merit. This practice is also considered to be the best practice for hiring decisions, for example, by advance. And it's often perceived by general public as the practice that is leading to merit-based decisions. So what our work is doing is we have examined preliminary criteria and overall impact score that gets assigned to applications at the early stage of the review process. And maybe this is a good time to stop and see if there are questions about the review process, maybe some of the prior findings, etc., before I dive into our own work. Okay. Okay. All right. So our work considers R01 applications submitted by Black and white principal investigators. And we only had access to those applications that were reviewed by CSR, which is the vast majority of applications during the fiscal years 2014-2016. So we had access to all of the Black applications. And then there were 2 subsets of the white applications that we had access to. One is the white PI matched applications, and another one is the white PI random applications. So these 2 were selected from all of the applications submitted by white PIs, R01 applications, and reviewed by CSR during 2014-2016. We employed a special case of coarsening exact matching. That's a matching technique that had exact matching on 8 key variables thought to be related to scores and award rates. And we had complete coarsening on the rest of the variables. In this talk, I will present results from our matched subset analysis, which are also more valid because it's a little bit more of an apples and apples comparison after matching. But we also redone this analysis on the random subset, and the main conclusions were largely confirmed with the random subset.
Elena?
Yes.
It looks like we have some questions in the Q&A. There's one from Stephanie. She's asking, are the PI names known to the reviewers during the review?
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. The PI names are known to reviewers during the review at NIH normally. Yes, but it is a very good question because it reminds me to emphasize that the racial information is not known to reviewers. We have racial information in our study from the demographics that are self-reported. So actually on this slide, I am listing the demographics that we have, and race and ethnicity and gender are self-reported.
And, oh, sorry, wait, did you?
But reviewers do not know, do not see this data. They only see, they see the PI's name, they do not see their self-reported demographics.
Okay. And Suzanne May said, to my knowledge, reviewers don't know the race and ethnicity of the PI or other co-I. Is that what your understanding is?
Yeah, so like I said, the reviewers do not see the self-reported demographics by the PIs, but there are ways that they can potentially glean some information about it. For example, they could up the individual by their name. They could look them up online. They could infer it from the place of work or some of the awards that the PI might have received during their career. Yeah, really good questions.
Thank you, Elena. That's all we have for now.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, and don't hesitate to speak up or raise your hand or send me questions in the chat here. Okay, so these are the 8 matching variables, and they are applicants' gender, ethnicity, and career stage and degree type, plus the NIH funding bean. That is a variable that was created to control for kind of prestige of the institution where these PIs work. And we also had 3 matching variables that were application specific. That was application type, new or renewal, amended status, whether the application was amended or not, and integrated review group. So we were matching within this kind of broad topical area, which is integrated review group. There's a question, the names themselves may also suggest race, ethnicity, and yes, that's absolutely right. Okay, so the matching was done at the level of applications, not at the level of PIs. And here's some summary statistics for our data set. So essentially we ended up with 456 matched Black PIs in the data, and they were matched to roughly 1,500 white individuals, and then we also had roughly 1,900 in the random subset of the white individuals. And in terms of applications, it's close to 1,000 applications from Black PIs, 1,600 from white PIs matched applications, and about 2,000 white PIs random applications. So again, results in this talk, I will mostly focus on the matched study results. So first of all, we looked at the finding gap in this data. And we did this much before the Hoppe paper was published. So we wanted to make sure that there is still a finding gap with these enhanced NIH peer review process much later after Ginter published her first studies. And we found that comparing to random white, Black applicants award rate in our data was 56%. And the real award percentages were 11% for the Black applicants versus 19.7% for the white applicants. Now, after matching, this discrepancy in award rates went down. So matched Black applicants award rate was 75%, right? Less of a discrepancy, and the exact award rates after matching were 11.6 for Black PIs and 13.4 for white PIs. So this was just to confirm that there is a funding gap for us to still work with, right? And the matching on these 8 key variables did not get rid of that funding gap. Our study's main focus is preliminary scores. So what do you need to know about application scoring in peer review? Well, there is definitely an expectation to see some variability in reviewer scores. And that variability is expected to reviewers' differences in their areas of expertise, in their scientific interests and preferences, in their value systems. That variability may also be encouraged by program officers who are actively seeking diverse experience and opinions. This is all what the peer review is about. Now, we could also expect to see some differences in commensuration practices when criteria scores are present. What is commensuration? Commensuration is a process of combining criteria scores into an overall score. And this expectation is motivated by psychological research, which demonstrates that in calculating of the overall scores, criteria scores can be aggregated in ways that favor members of preferred social groups. And this could be done subconsciously, much like the implicit bias. So we hypothesized coming into this study that there will be Black-white differences in commensuration practices. We're working with application scores, and these are preliminary scores. So all of the submitted applications have these scores. The 5 criteria scores are significance, investigator, innovation, approach, and environment, and there is a preliminary overall impact score. And these scores are given by the assigned reviewers before they have a chance to talk to everybody else at their scientific review group. We have a number of other covariates to take into account, and most importantly is the set of what we call structural covariates. So these are variables that are telling us about the structure of the review, right? And primarily it's the integrated review group and the scientific review group. So SRG is a smaller study section. IRG is kind of bigger umbrella for a few study sections. And then on top is the NIH Institute or Center, which is making funding decisions. And then there is a number of ID variables. In particularly, we had an application ID that had multiple reviewers. We had an applicant ID that, again, we had some applicants in this data set who submitted more than one application. And we had a reviewer ID. We had reviewers who reviewed across multiple applications. All of our data were encrypted, so we did not have any identifying information. We also had a range of applicant-specific variables. These are self-reported demographics, but also career stage, terminate degree year, NIH funding history, geographic location, broadly in the US. These university or institute prestige measured by NIH funding being proxy, whether institution is administering a graduate program, and most importantly, whether the institution is a minority serving institution. And then we had a set of application-specific variables. Application type, whether it was a type 1 or type 2, solicitation type, whether the application was amended, had multiple PIs. We had the costs that were requested, the number of support years requested in the R01, council year of review, review group type, standing or special, and then a number of special codes that about human, animal, child, gender, and minority subjects for these applications. So as you can see, we had a host of all different kinds of information. And we're really interested to model the preliminary impact score from all of this multi-level data. So we let the preliminary impact score for the ith review of the JF application from the KPI reviewed by the ELF reviewer and the mth SRG. That's a mouthful and a lot of indices. But the basic idea is that we construct a multi-level model for these impact scores. The key variables here are the race indicator variable and the number of covariates. And covariates will range depending on the particular model that we consider. Plus, we have 3 random effects here that are random intercepts for PI, reviewer, and SRG, and the random error term at the end. And these models had the usual normality and independence assumptions across the error terms. So for the random effects, I would like to emphasize that the only random effect here that was maybe questionable is the random effect for SRG, because these SRG groups, these errors potentially might be correlated with the random error at the end of our equation. And we tested that by using Hausmann test for endogeneity. And then we concluded that actually using random effect specification here was plausible, which also gave us consistent and efficient estimates for the fixed effects from this model specification. In addition, random SRG effects also aligns well with our understanding of the nature of scientific review groups. They are not set in stone. New ones come up as the science evolves. I'm sure we have a lot of new SRGs now with the pandemic. And in addition, if some of you might be wondering, application ID could not be included as a random effect because that variability was captured by the PI ID.
Elena, you have another question from an anonymous person.
All right. I think I can read it, Christine.
Oh,
I see now. Okay, so the question is, what is endogeneity and why is it an issue? Well, I explained this briefly. So the assumption in these models is that our random effects, these are unrelated of the random error term at the end. Okay, so if there is a correlation, that another way to say that there is a correlation is to say that this random effect is endogenous. Okay, so economists came up with this term and they like it. Okay, I hope that answers the question. Basically, that violates some of the model assumptions, and we made sure that those model assumptions are not violated. Okay, so here's some results. These block of results presents results on racial disparities and preliminary impact scores. And what you need to know from this busy table is that we fit 4 different models. So all of these models were for preliminary impact score as a function of various covariates that I showed you before. So by block, I distinguish between structural covariates that tell us about the structure of reviewers at NIH. And you can see that all of my models include those structural covariates, because otherwise we really should not trust this model. This is the kind of fundamental multi-level structure that we should take into account in any analysis. Then we also have PI and application characteristics. And some of the models are, in particular, in model 2 and model 4, controlled for those variables. And then finally, we have criteria scores, and model 3 and model 4 controlled for those variables. And I'm only presenting you the coefficient for the race effect that is most important here. That's the focus of our analysis. And I am also given the block for the estimates of the random effect coefficients, and that's also going to be quite important. So all of the other estimates for control variables are not shown here. The definition of the raised fixed effect is, that's the coefficient for our raised variable in the multi-level model. So this is the estimate that is presented on those slides. Suzanne, I hope I answered your question. And again, I'm presenting you results from the matched subset, okay? So let's look at these results in turn. First, I would like to use the estimates of the variance terms, and in particular, random effects and the residual standard deviation estimates. So what you could see here is that controlling for criteria scores, and again, models 3 and 4 are those that control for criteria scores, right? We see that controlling for criteria scores decreases the residual error substantially. To the contrary, though, controlling for PI and application covariates does not seem to make a much difference in terms of the residual standard error in these models. Okay. We also see, and this is very important, that controlling for criteria scores does not explain the impact score fully. So it's not like the overall impact score is a basic function of the criteria scores. You know, people don't just add them up and this is how they come up with the overall score. No, it's a more involved process that we don't know what it is, but it's not one-to-one match. We also see that controlling for criterion scores decreases random variability estimates that are due to reviewer, PI, and SRG. So all of these estimates are much smaller compared to the similar estimates from models 1 and 2, where we do not control for criteria scores. That is to be expected. And now let's look at the estimate for the raised effect. And that estimate, so this data is essentially telling us that this is the average difference in the overall impact score between black PIs and white PIs, controlling for all of the structural variables in the NIH review. And you can see, because with NIH scores, the smaller score is considered to be better, and these scores are ranging from 1 to 9, by the way. The estimates of these beta coefficients are positive, right? So that means that preliminary overall impact scores are worse for black PIs. Difference of 0.3 in our analysis, we find that this difference is quite substantial near the finding cutoff, right? So 0.3 points difference in the preliminary overall impact score could truly make a huge difference for an application, whether it's going to be discussed and go on to the next stage and have a shot at getting the funding, or whether it's not going to be discussed or being funded. These difference, for example, could move an application from the 15th to either the 20th percentile, if it's a difference for the worse, or the 12th percentile, if that's a difference for the better. So that is a big, big impact. Now, I should also note here that these estimates, the structural covariates, do include area of science via SRG and IRG and administering institutes. And we see that this disparity does remain significant both practically and statistically, after controlling for the PI and application variables. We also see, and this is quite interesting, that the disparity in impact is essentially negligible after we have criteria scores in our models. So these estimates for the race coefficient, or basically the difference between Black PI's scores in overall impact and white PI scores, are no longer statistically significant, and they're very small. They're they're quite negligible, right? So what's going on? Well, one way to understand what is going on is to look at some nice plots that Sheridan prepared. I'm showing you the histograms for preliminary criterion and overall impact scores. So this figure has two panels. In the top panel, we have the histograms for the matched subset. And there, in the purple, we have the matched Black PIs. In the yellow, we have the matched white PIs. And in the orange, we have the overlap between those two sets of scores, right? So for example, if you look at the overall impact here, you kind of see here's the purple that's sticking out on the right, here's the yellow that's sticking out on the left, and the overlap is in between, right? So the purple on the right essentially means that Black investigators have more scores that are worse because they're on the right, right? And the yellow on the left says that white investigators have more scores that are better, comparatively speaking. And again, this whole first row is for the matched subset. So it's quite interesting to see the differences rather uniform for the overall impact score, but also for each of the criterion scores. And just to summarize, applications from Black PIs tend to receive worse, higher scores, not only on the overall impact, but also on all criteria. And this difference is more pronounced for the comparison with random white PIs. So you may ask, well, what about commensuration practices? How does that add to the picture? Well, to answer that question, we fit a commensuration model, and the difference with the previous model is essentially in this interaction term, which also gives us the commensuration coefficients, okay? So that interaction term is telling us whether some of the scores, criteria scores, are being combined or differentially weighted depending on the race as they are impacting the overall impact score. Okay. All of the other assumptions of the model are the same. So fitting this linear commensuration model for preliminary overall impact scores, we obtained the following results. And in this table, what you need to notice, well, first of all, we notice that all of our criterion scores, the main effects of those, except for the environment here, are very significant, and they're all positive, right? So the higher the criterion score, the higher the overall impact score, which does make sense. And then the second point that is our main point here is that we did find one interaction that was significant enough to qualify for new discovery. And that interaction was between approach and race, okay? And let me talk through what that means. So that coefficient was positive. And this means that the Black PIs appear to be significantly penalized for their approach. In other words, if there is a Black investigator who had the same score for approach and the white investigator as one of the white investigators, this Black investigator tends to have a little bit higher, so worse impact score compared to that same white investigator. On the other hand, there are other interactions that had negative signs, right, estimated, and those appear to be rewarding Black applicants for significance, innovation, and environment. Now, those are not statistically significant at the 0.01 level, so we should not be interpreting them too much, but I'm just emphasizing this because the coefficients are both positive and negative over all of the interaction terms. So in order to make sense of this a bit more, we need to consider the combined effect of commensuration practices, right? Because the application doesn't come with just the approach, it comes with all of the other criteria scored. And as a combined effect, these commensuration practices can be represented by a histogram here. So this histogram and this whole figure is giving us expected distributions of differences in preliminary overall impact score. And in the histogram, we're showing those differences that are due to commensuration practices, right? So as we're able to look across all of the R01 applications submitted and across all of the possible various ways of scoring those applications, this histogram summarizes the differences in the impact scores between Black investigators and white investigators that would be due to commensuration practices. And you can see that very few of these differences, in fact less than 15%, are greater than 0.1, right? In the contrast, the reviewer and the residual variability that for comparison is plotted here with the red curve for reviewer and blue curve for residual variability, those are much larger, right? They're overwhelmingly greater than the commensuration potential. So even though we're finding one of the coefficients to be significant, our conclusion is that there is little evidence for substantial commensuration practices that are going on. So to summarize, the conclusions from our study are that Black applicants receive worse preliminary overall impact scores controlling for a variety of PI and application characteristics. And of course, controlling for all of the structural variables related to the NIH review. We also conclude that preliminary criteria scores absorb rather than mitigate racial disparities in preliminary overall impact scores. And remember that these preliminary overall impact scores are hugely important in order for these applications to go on to the next stage and be discussed. We find little evidence for racial disparities emerging in the process of combining criteria scores. So we do not think that there is ground for substantial commensuration practices. Now, what are the implications here? Well, one I have already mentioned, and it's these preliminary scores are real because they determine which applications are going on to the next stage and have a shot at funding. The other implication is related to the peer review procedures as a whole. And recently, there have been some calls for administering research funding by partial lottery. In particularly, the suggestions are, well, let's carry out a round of peer review to remove the weakest proposals. And then among the strongest proposals, we are going to have a lottery to select at random which proposal gets funded. So there are lots of arguments here, partly because there is a lot of noise in these peer review systems, But also there is some hope that these lottery approaches will eliminate or at least alleviate biases. However, because as we show in our work, racial disparities are present at the earliest stages of peer review, lottery approaches that are blind to race may actually perpetuate Black-white funding gaps. And we summarize this idea in a recent publication as well. So let me pose some open questions to you. I hope there are many statisticians in the audience, and I think this area does badly need statisticians. One of the open questions are Criterion scores are actually being used as intended by psychologists as would be best practice. And what I mean here is, do people really focus their attention on the criteria scores first before they're coming up with the overall score? Second, it's a big question of why, right? Why do Black PIs receive worse preliminary scores? So we had a lot of additional variables, but we didn't have everything that's possible out there, including we did not have bibliometrics, and we did not have variables about social networks of the applicants. And for this question, why, there are multiple explanations that are possible. That includes implicit bias, Black-white differences in productivity and impact that perpetuate the cycle, and cumulative disparities in mentorship and social networks. If we think about proposal scores as statisticians, we can consider this to just be a measurement problem, right? So suppose there is some true underlying quality of a proposal that we're trying to measure by asking different reviewers to review this proposal and give us their score. So the questions to statisticians are, can current review practices acknowledge uncertainty in peer review scores and take those into account for decision making? What is the best way to communicate this uncertainty as well as take it into account? We can also ask, can these review practices be improved to achieve better precision and less error in this measurement, yet preserve diversity of opinion? So these are all questions that are really open. I see there is a really good question in the Q&A, and I will get to it right after I do my final acknowledgements here, which is, in addition to acknowledging my collaborators on this project, whose pictures you saw on the first slide, I also would like to acknowledge some funding and the support from CSSS administration that had given us an additional office to keep our NIH laptops secure. Also some support from the Laboratoire du Données from Université Côte d'Azur 2 years ago. And a lot of that time was spent on this work. I'm also very grateful to all of my colleagues and collaborators on current projects that are helping me shape some of my thinking with peer review. Patricia Martinkova, Marina, Mela, Thomas Richardson, Feng Xie, Michael Pierce, Stephen Gallo, and Gary Chen. So thank you, and I'm happy to take questions, and there is this great one in the chat, which is, would it help if the initial review of proposals was blind to PI and institution, to PI name and institution? I think it would certainly, my personal opinion, I think it would certainly help. The extent to which it would help is unclear. But what I can tell you is that NIH is experimenting with having the initial review being blind for some of the mechanisms. They've introduced these new reviews where exactly what you suggest, the initial step is focused on significance and innovation of the project. And at that point, reviewers do not see any of the PI identifying information. So these are some of the, as far as I know, experimental approaches by the NIH. But also the NIH had conducted an anonymization study where they took existing applications and tried to anonymize them to remove all of the identity about the reviewer entirely. And as far as I know, the findings from that study was not published yet, but they were already presented at the joint statistical meetings. And the key takeaway there was that despite several hours of work that was needed to anonymize applications, if I remember correctly, about 20% of those PI identity from anonymized applications was actually recovered, guessed basically by reviewers. So it's really hard to make this process entirely stripped of identity. There's another question that I'll read, but I would love for people to just turn on their mic and ask their questions as well. So this question was from Francie. Was there a structural reason the reviews weren't blind in the past? Did the name and institution assist with peer review in any way? Is this a relic of the past? Well, I cannot answer for the NIH and other grant reviewing agencies. I think there is a lot of information in knowing the name of the institution and the name of the PI as well, especially if that PI does have a track record or does not have a track record. So is this a relic of the past? I don't know that this is a question that I can answer as well. I think it's, there are a lot of people who really care deeply about peer review. Somebody might be better positioned to answer this than me.
I have a question. So you found that it was particularly the approach criterion that explained a good portion of the difference, right? Do you know why that is?
So the question is why approach explains a good portion of the difference? Well, no, that's not precisely right. If you are referring to, there are two things you may be referring to, and I'm not sure what you're referring to exactly. I think it was Nicholas who was speaking.
Yeah, I guess I was just asking, like, do you have any idea why that interaction term is significant and positive?
Okay, no. The short answer is no. Yeah. A bit longer answer is that the approach criterion is also the one that's much more related to the overall impact, right? Because this coefficient is really large here. So it could be related to that, but yeah, we do not know why necessarily approach came out here as significant in the interactions. So Suzanne is asking another question. Reviewers are asked whether the investigators have the knowledge, experience, and environment appropriate to conduct the research, which is impossible blinded. Oh, yes. Thank you, Suzanne. Yeah, so reviewers need to assess whether investigators have the knowledge, experience, and environment appropriate to conduct the research. So yeah, this does say that at some point, reviewers do need to know whether they need to know something about the environment and the investigator to make that assessment. Other questions?
Any questions for Elena? Very exciting talk, very interesting, and yes.
Yeah, I've got one. so do you, like, how might we go about investigating? I mean, like, so the finding is that, you know, these disparities appear to be kind of, you know, in the criterion scores, right? Like kind of deeply ingrained in the criterion scores. So like, how might we go about like figuring out causality for that, right? How would we figure out what is causing those racial disparities in the criterion scores?
Yeah, thank you, Sharon, for that question. I mean, I think it goes back to this set of questions, why, right? That is on this slide. So
Yeah,
there are
totally.
multiple explanations that are possible. I don't really have a like a experimental setup in mind to answer those questions, and they probably should be considered completely separately. Do you have something to share, Sheridan?
Well, no, not really. I mean, it would kind of appear that, I mean, was this anonymization study going for that in any way? I mean, you've got this classic experiment where you send in the same job application forms, but with different names, right? Names that sound, you know, white or names that sound black. And you use that as a proxy to try and see if people are discriminating in hiring, right? So you could, you know, you might think that you could do something similar with grant proposals. Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering, you know, has anybody thought about that? Was that a component of this anonymization study? You know, is it practical? Yeah, that's maybe the only idea I had on that front, but I was wondering if others are out there.
Yeah, not that I know of. I do know though that the anonymization study was essentially had that idea, is let's get rid of all of the information from the applications and have reviewers score those applications that are not having any identifying information about the PI or the university, and then compare the scores to see if, you know, what happens. I think what they found is that the scores for white applicants go worse just a little bit, but for the black applicants there was no change in those scores. But what I think is also quite interesting, what they found is that it was really hard to do. So separate the identity from the review was just really hard and close to impossible.
Gotcha, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Elena, there's another question from Suzanne about like in my experience with study sections, people don't tend to update like a criteria score if the application is not discussed.
Yeah, I think this is more a comment, and thanks, Suzanne, for that comment.
Other questions for Elena? Okay, if no, I think people are very eager for the weekend, so I think that would be the talk. Yeah, it's great. It's a great talk, and thanks for everyone to participating in this seminar, and I'll see you all in the next week. And thanks, Elena, again for this wonderful seminar.
Thank you, Yanqi, and everybody. Thank you for coming, and feel free to send me questions by email if you want to express any. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you.
Bye.